I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of my house shaking like a paint mixer, and my first thought was that this was it. This was how I died, crushed under my own roof in suburban Oklahoma during the worst ice storm in 20 years. The wind was howling so loud, it sounded like a freight train parked in my backyard, and I could hear things flying around outside, slamming into walls and windows. I grabbed my phone and checked the weather alert for the 100th time that night. The whole of Norman, Oklahoma was under a severe ice storm warning, and the meteorologists were telling everyone to stay inside unless they had an absolute emergency. Power lines were down across half the city, and temperatures had dropped to 15 degrees with more ice expected through the morning. I'm Zachary Reynolds, and I've lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision for 3 years now. I'm a software engineer who works from home, which usually means I'm the guy who actually sees all the neighborhood drama unfold in real time while everyone else is at the office. I bought this place because it was affordable, had a nice yard, and seemed quiet. What I didn't account for was the HOA, or more specifically, the HOA president. A woman named Brenda Patterson who treated our little neighborhood like it was her own personal kingdom. Brenda was 52 years old, bleached blonde hair always done up in that speak to the manager style, and she wore enough foundation to spackling a small wall. She drove a white Escalade with a custom license plate that said HOA Boss, and she meant it. Every violation notice, every complaint, every petty grievance in our neighborhood went through her, and she loved every second of the power trip. I'd had run-ins with her before over the color of my mailbox, which she claimed was off-white when the HOA bylaws clearly stated, pure white. I'd measured the paint against the official color swatch and proved her wrong, but that only made her hate me more. But right now, at 3 in the morning during an ice storm, Brenda Patterson was the last thing on my mind. I was worried about my propane tank. See, my house runs on a combination of electric and propane. The electric covers most things but my backup generator, my water heater, and my kitchen stove all run on propane. With the power out and no telling when it would come back on, that propane tank was literally what was going to keep me from freezing to death over the next few days. I'd invested in a really good setup too. 500-gallon propane tank, painted white to match the house, sitting on a concrete pad on the side of my property. The propane company had installed it 2 years ago, and I just had it refilled 3 weeks earlier. I was sitting at about 80% capacity, which meant I had plenty to get through this storm and then some. But here's where I'd gotten clever. After reading about propane theft in rural areas, I'd ordered a special locking GPS cap for the tank. It was a heavy-duty device that screwed onto the main valve, and not only locked it shut so no one could access the propane, but it also had a GPS tracker built in. If anyone moved my tank, I'd get an alert on my phone and could track its exact location. I thought I was being paranoid when I installed it 6 months ago. Turns out I wasn't paranoid enough. The storm raged on through the night. I dozed on and off, wrapped in blankets on my couch, listening to the ice pelting my windows. My generator was in the garage, hooked up and ready to go, but I was trying to conserve propane by not running it unless I absolutely had to. The house was already down to 58 degrees, and I could see my breath in the air. When dawn finally broke around 7:30, the world outside looked like a disaster movie. Everything was coated in at least 2 inches of solid ice. Trees had branches snapped off, power lines were down across the street, and someone's trampoline was wedged in a tree 4 houses down. I bundled up in my winter coat and boots and carefully made my way outside to check on the property. The steps were treacherous, and I had to hold onto the railing to keep from falling on my rear. I made my way around to the side yard where my propane tank sat, or should I say, where my propane tank used to sit. The concrete pad was empty, just a flat sheet of ice-covered concrete with 4 bolt holes where my 500-gallon propane tank had been anchored. I stood there for a full 30 seconds, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Someone had stolen my propane tank during an ice storm, in the middle of the night. They'd somehow managed to unbolt a 500-gallon tank that weighed, even at 80% full, probably close to 1,800 pounds, and haul it away. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, and not just from the cold. I opened the GPS tracking app for the locking cap, and sure enough, there it was. A little blue dot showing the location of my propane tank, and it wasn't far. In fact, it was only about 4 streets over, right in the heart of Meadowbrook Estates. The address showed 842 Willow Creek Drive. I knew that address. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that address. That was Brenda Patterson's house. My mind was racing. Brenda had stolen my propane tank. The HOA president had committed actual theft, and during a state of emergency, no less. But why? And more importantly, how? The logistics alone seemed impossible. But then I remembered something. Brenda's husband, Doug, owned a landscaping company. He had trucks, trailers, and equipment. A truck with a winch could absolutely move a propane tank, especially if you had 2 or 3 people helping. I took screenshots of the GPS location, making sure to capture the timestamp and the address. Then I carefully made my way back inside and started making calls. First, I called the non-emergency police line. It rang for a solid 5 minutes before someone picked up. The dispatcher sounded exhausted. "Norman Police, what's your emergency?" "Hi, I need to report a theft. Someone stole my propane tank during the storm last night." There was a long pause. "Sir, we've got multiple vehicle accidents, down power lines, medical emergencies, and stranded motorists. Unless someone is in immediate danger, we can't send an officer out right now." "I understand, but I have GPS tracking on the tank. I know exactly where it is. It's at a house in my neighborhood." Another pause. "Can you file an online report?" "We'll get to it as soon as we can, but right now we're completely overwhelmed." I tried to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Sure, I can do that. But just so you know, the person who took it is the HOA president, and without that propane, I don't have heat or hot water." "I understand, sir." "File the report online, and we'll follow up when we can." "I'm sorry, but that's the best I can do right now." I hung up and immediately went to the police department's website to file the report. I included everything: the GPS screenshots, the address where the tank was located, the estimated value of the tank and propane, and Brenda's name and role as HOA president. I also made it clear that this was essential equipment during a state of emergency. Next, I called my propane company, Reliable Propane Services. They were actually answering their phones, probably because half the city was having propane emergencies. I explained the situation to the guy who answered, a man named Martin who'd been out to service my tank before. "Wait, someone stole your entire tank?" Martin sounded incredulous. "Yes, and I have GPS proof of where it is. It's at 842 Willow Creek Drive, about 4 streets from my house." "That's insane." "Okay, so here's the thing. That tank belongs to you. You purchased it outright. The propane inside is also yours. You paid for it. So this is definitely theft. But we can't just go onto someone's property and take it back without police involvement. That would be us committing theft. The police are overwhelmed with the storm. They said they'd follow up, but it could be days." Martin sighed. "Okay, let me call my supervisor. This is a weird situation. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. While I waited, I did something probably stupid. I got in my car and very carefully drove the 4 streets over to Brenda's house. The roads were terrifying, solid ice with hardly any traction, but my SUV has 4-wheel drive and I took it at about 5 miles per hour. It took me 15 minutes to go what would normally be a 2-minute drive. Brenda's house was one of the biggest in the neighborhood, a 2-story colonial with white columns and a circular driveway. And there, sitting on her side yard on what looked like a hastily cleared spot, was my propane tank. I could see it from the street, the white paint, the size, everything. And I could see the locking GPS cap still attached to the valve. She hadn't even tried to remove it yet. I took more pictures and video, making sure to capture the address number on her house and the tank in the same frame. Then, I noticed something else. There were muddy tire tracks leading from the street to where the tank sat, and they were fresh enough that the ice hadn't completely covered them yet. Someone had definitely driven a vehicle across her lawn to place the tank there. As I was taking pictures, the front door of Brenda's house opened and out she came, wrapped in a puffy pink coat and fuzzy boots. She marched down her driveway toward my car, her face already twisted into that angry expression she wore so well. I rolled down my window as she approached, making sure my phone was still recording. "Zachary Reynolds, what are you doing sitting outside my house taking pictures? That's harassment." Her voice was shrill even in the cold morning air. "Hi, Brenda. I'm documenting my stolen property." "That's my propane tank on your lawn." Her face went through several colors from pink to red to almost purple. "That is not your tank, that's my tank. I had it delivered yesterday before the storm." "Really?" "Because that tank has a GPS tracker on it, and it shows it was at my house until approximately 4:30 this morning, at which point it traveled directly here. Also, you can see my address number engraved on the side if you look closely. I had it done for insurance purposes." Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "You're insane. That's my tank. Get off my property before I call the police. I'm on the street, which is public property, and please do call the police. I'd love to have them come out and verify the serial number on that tank, which is registered to me. You can't prove anything. That tank is mine. I'm the HOA president and I know my rights. Being HOA president doesn't give you the right to steal people's property, Brenda. Now, you can either admit you took it and help me get it back to my property, or I can let the police sort it out. But either way, that tank is going back to my house." She stepped closer to my car and I could smell the coffee on her breath. "You listen to me. I have been patient with you. I've dealt with your violations, your attitude, your constant questioning of HOA authority. But I will not have you accusing me of theft. That tank was here when we woke up this morning. Someone must have abandoned it on our property during the storm. So someone just randomly abandoned a propane tank on your lawn during an ice storm, and it just happens to be the same make, model, and size as mine, which went missing at the exact same time. That's what must have happened. Now leave before I get a restraining order." I rolled up my window and backed up carefully, driving back home. My phone rang before I even made it to my street. It was Martin from the propane company. "Zachary, I talked to my boss. He says we need a police report number before we can do anything. But he also said if you can prove ownership, you have every legal right to be on that property to retrieve your tank. He suggested maybe getting a lawyer involved if the police can't respond quickly." "Thanks, Martin. I've already filed a police report online. I'm going to call a lawyer next." "Good luck, man. This is the craziest thing I've heard in 15 years in this business." I spent the next hour calling lawyers. Most weren't answering because of the storm, but I finally got through to a law office that specialized in property disputes. The attorney who answered was a woman named Rachel Chen, and she sounded very interested in my case. So let me get this straight. The HOA president stole your propane tank during a declared state of emergency, and you have GPS evidence. That's exactly right. I have screenshots, photos, video, everything. This is potentially criminal theft, but it's also a civil matter. The value of the tank and propane is probably around $3,000, which makes it a felony in Oklahoma. But here's what I can do right now. I can draft a demand letter and have it delivered to her electronically within the hour. It'll state that she has 24 hours to return the property or face legal action. I can also file for an emergency temporary restraining order that would require her to not damage or tamper with the tank. That might take a few days given the storm, but it's something. How much will this cost me? Initial consultation and the demand letter, $500. If this goes further, we can discuss a retainer. But honestly, if you have the evidence you say you have, I think she'll back down once she realizes you're serious. Do it. Send the letter. I gave Rachel all the information she needed, along with Brenda's email address and home address. She said she'd have the demand letter sent within 2 hours. In the meantime, I posted about the situation in our neighborhood Facebook group, which had about 200 members. I didn't name names, but I said someone had stolen my propane tank during the storm, and I had GPS proof. The responses came flooding in. A neighbor named Tom Hendricks commented, "Are you serious? Who steals a propane tank during an ice storm? That's low." Another neighbor, Jennifer Wu, "I saw a truck on our street around 4 this morning, thought it was weird but figured it was emergency services." Then things got interesting. A guy named Paul Martinez, who lived 2 streets over, commented, "Wait, is this about the tank now sitting at the Patterson house? I drove by there this morning and thought it was weird they suddenly had a tank on their side yard. They've always had natural gas." The cat was out of the bag. Within minutes, dozens of comments were piling on, all expressing shock and anger that Brenda, of all people, would steal from a neighbor. Someone started a separate thread discussing all the petty things Brenda had done as HOA president. The community was turning on her fast. My phone started ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Is this Zachary Reynolds?" It was a man's voice, gruff and tired. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Doug Patterson, Brenda's husband. We need to talk." "I'm listening." There was a long silence. "Look, I didn't know she was going to do this. I woke up at 6 this morning and found her trying to figure out how to get that cap off your tank. She told me she'd bought it and had it delivered in the middle of the night, which I thought was insane, but she swore that's what happened. Then I saw your post in the Facebook group. So you had nothing to do with stealing it." "I swear on my life. I was asleep. I have no idea how she even moved it. My trucks are all parked at the business lot. But then I checked my truck GPS because they all have fleet tracking. One of my trucks was taken out at 3:45 this morning and driven to your street, then to my house, then back to the lot. Brenda must have taken my keys." This was getting better and better. "So you're saying you have GPS records of your truck being used in the theft?" "Yeah. And I'm not going down for this. Brenda's lost her mind. She's been obsessing about you ever since that mailbox thing. She thinks you're undermining her authority. Last night during the storm, our power went out and we didn't have heat. We have natural gas for cooking but not for heat because our furnace is electric. She kept ranting about how you probably had heat because of your propane setup. Doug, I need you to help me get my tank back. I will, but I need to do this right. I'm calling the police myself and reporting what she did. I'm not losing my business license or going to jail because my wife has gone crazy with power. The police are swamped. They said they'd get to it eventually. I know people at the department. Let me make some calls. In the meantime, I'm locking her out of my truck keys. She's not destroying my business over this. Doug hung up and I sat there processing everything. This had gone from simple theft to a full domestic situation. My phone buzzed with an email from Rachel Chen. The demand letter had been sent to Brenda Patterson via certified email. It was beautifully written, laying out the facts, the evidence, and the legal consequences if she didn't return the property. It demanded return of the tank within 24 hours and payment for any propane used, plus legal fees. I forwarded the email to Doug Patterson. He deserved to know what was coming. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls and messages. The neighborhood Facebook group had become a full-on forum about Brenda's theft, with people sharing their own stories of her abuse of power. Someone dug up the HOA bylaws and pointed out that the president could actually be removed by a 2/3 vote of the board, which consisted of 5 people. Someone else started an online petition to remove her. Within hours, it had 60 signatures around 2 in the afternoon. My doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw a Norman police officer standing on my porch, carefully keeping his balance on the icy steps. I opened the door. Zachary Reynolds. Yes, officer. I'm Officer David Martinez. I understand you reported a stolen propane tank. I invited him in and showed him everything. The GPS tracking data, the photos, the videos, the timeline. I showed him the demand letter from my attorney and told him about Doug Patterson's call. Officer Martinez took notes on everything. I've got to say, this is one of the strangest cases I've handled. We actually got a call from Doug Patterson about an hour ago. He came down to the station with his truck's GPS records. He's claiming his wife took his truck without permission to commit the theft. Is he pressing charges against her? He's considering it. But right now, my job is to investigate the theft of your property. Based on what you've shown me, I have probable cause to seize the tank as evidence and return it to your property. Would you be willing to accompany me to the Patterson residence? Absolutely. We took the officer's SUV, which had better traction than my vehicle. The drive over to Brenda's house took only a few minutes. Doug's truck was in the driveway now, and I could see him standing in the garage. Officer Martinez pulled up to the curb and we both got out. Brenda came storming out of the house before we even made it to the driveway. Officer, thank God you're here. This man has been harassing me all day. I want him arrested. Officer Martinez held up a hand. Madam, I'm here to investigate a theft report. I need to examine the propane tank on your property. That's my tank. He's trying to steal it from me. Madam, I have multiple pieces of evidence that suggest otherwise. I need you to step back and let me do my job. Doug walked over looking exhausted. Brenda, just stop. They know everything. I showed them the truck GPS. I told them what you did. Brenda's face went white. You what? You're my husband. You're supposed to support me. I'm not going to jail because you decided to steal someone's property during an ice storm. This is insane. Officer Martinez walked over to the propane tank and examined it. He took photos from multiple angles, including close-ups of the locking GPS cap and the serial number engraved on the side. Then he took out his radio and called for backup to help move the tank. Brenda was screaming now. You can't take that. That's my property. I'm the HOA president. I have authority here. Officer Martinez turned to her. Madam, the HOA has no legal authority to take someone's property. That's theft. And based on the evidence I've seen, including GPS tracking data and security footage that Mr. Reynolds has from his home camera system, I'm treating this as a theft investigation. Wait, I had security camera footage. I'd forgotten about that. My doorbell camera and side yard camera had caught something, apparently. I pulled out my phone and checked the app. Sure enough, my side yard camera had captured grainy footage of a truck pulling up at 3:52 in the morning, and several figures in dark clothing working to unbolt and load the tank. The footage was low quality because of the darkness and ice, but it was definitely there. I showed it to Officer Martinez. He watched it twice, then showed it to Doug. "Is that your truck?" Doug nodded miserably. "Yeah, that's my Ford F-350. You can see the company logo on the door. And do you recognize any of those people?" Doug squinted at the screen. "That's Brenda. I can tell by the coat. And I think that might be her brother, Kevin, and maybe one of the other HOA board members." This was huge. Brenda hadn't acted alone. She'd recruited help to steal my tank. Officer Martinez called for additional units. Within 30 minutes, there were 3 police vehicles on Brenda Street. The other officers helped coordinate the removal of my tank. They used Doug's equipment with his permission to load it onto a flatbed and transport it back to my property. Brenda was arrested at 4:15 that afternoon. They charged her with felony theft, criminal trespass, and conspiracy. Officer Martinez explained that they'd be investigating the other people involved as well. Doug stood by and watched his wife get put in handcuffs and placed in the back of a police cruiser. He looked broken. As they were putting her in the car, Brenda was still yelling, "This is wrong. He's the criminal. He violated HOA bylaws. I was enforcing community standards." One of the officers shut the door on her protests. Officer Martinez turned to me. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement, but your tank should be back and secured within the hour." "Thank you, officer. I really appreciate you taking this seriously." Theft during a state of emergency is a serious matter. If people don't have heat during a storm like this, they can die. What she did was reckless and dangerous. They weren't kidding about the timeline. By 5:30 that evening, my propane tank was back on its concrete pad, bolted down securely. The propane company sent someone out to inspect it and make sure nothing had been damaged. Martin himself showed up, which I appreciated. "Everything looks good," he said after checking all the connections. "The locking cap probably saved you from having any propane stolen. She couldn't get it off without the key code." "That was the best $200 I ever spent." Martin laughed. "I'm going to recommend these to all our customers now. This is wild." After Martin left, I finally had a chance to breathe. I fired up my generator and got some heat going in the house. I made myself dinner on my propane stove and took the hottest shower I'd had in 24 hours. The whole time, my phone kept buzzing with messages from neighbors. The story had spread through the entire community like wildfire. The next morning, I drove down to the police station to give my formal statement. The roads were still bad, but the temperature had risen above freezing and things were starting to melt. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Sarah Hernandez. She was thorough, asking me to walk through every detail of the incident. "We've identified 3 accomplices so far," she told me. Brenda Patterson's brother Kevin Mills and 2 other HOA board members, Carol Thompson and Richard Hayes. They all claimed they thought they were helping Brenda retrieve HOA property that you were illegally storing. Apparently, she told them you'd violated some rule and the tank needed to be impounded. That's ridiculous. The HOA has no authority to impound anything. We know that, and now they know that. They're all facing charges as well, though theirs might be reduced since they were acting on false information from Mrs. Patterson. But ignorance of the law isn't a complete defense. What happens next? Mrs. Patterson will be arraigned tomorrow. Given the evidence, I expect she'll either plead guilty or take a plea deal. The DA is taking this seriously because of the circumstances. Stealing essential utilities during a state of emergency could have resulted in serious harm or death. Is she still in jail? She posted bail this morning. $10,000. But she's been ordered to have no contact with you and to stay at least 500 feet away from your property. I left the station feeling strange. This whole situation had spiraled so far beyond what I'd ever imagined. A week ago, my biggest problem was HOA violations over the color of my mailbox. Now the HOA president was facing felony charges, and the entire board was in chaos. The neighborhood Facebook group had erupted into full civil war. Half the community was calling for a complete dissolution of the HOA. The other half was trying to salvage it by calling an emergency meeting to remove Brenda and elect new leadership. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening at the community center, assuming the power was back on by then. Doug Patterson reached out to me on Wednesday. He asked if we could meet for coffee, somewhere neutral. I agreed, curious about what he had to say. We met at a Starbucks on Main Street that had just gotten power restored. Doug looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 days. His eyes were bloodshot and he had the weary slump of a man who'd had his life turned upside down. "I owe you an apology," he started. "Not just for what Brenda did, but for enabling her for so long. She's been getting worse over the past year. The HOA thing became an obsession. She was spending hours every day looking for violations, sending out notices, arguing with people. I thought it was just her being thorough, but it was really about control. I appreciate you saying that, Doug, and I'm sorry you got dragged into this. I'm filing for divorce. I can't do this anymore. She's not the woman I married. This whole thing has shown me that." He took a sip of his coffee. "I wanted you to know that I'm willing to testify against her if it comes to trial. What she did was wrong, and I'm not going to protect her from the consequences." That must be a hard decision. It's the only decision. My business almost got destroyed because she used my truck to commit a felony. I've already had 2 clients call to cancel contracts because they saw the news coverage. I have employees who depend on me. I can't let her ruin that. We talked for another hour. Doug told me about Brenda's escalating behavior, the power trips, the way she'd alienated most of their friends because of her constant need to be in charge. He'd been in denial about it, but this incident had ripped away any illusions. The community meeting on Saturday was packed. Someone had set up a live stream because not everyone could make it in person. The roads were better, but a lot of people still didn't have power. I showed up early and found a seat near the back. The energy in the room was electric, and not in a good way. The meeting was called to order by Thomas Grant, the HOA secretary and the only board member who hadn't been involved in the theft. He looked nervous as he addressed the room. "I want to start by acknowledging the serious situation we're facing. As you all know, our president, Brenda Patterson, was arrested for theft. 2 other board members, Carol Thompson and Richard Hayes, are also facing charges. This leaves us with only 2 active board members, myself and our treasurer, Linda Foster. According to our bylaws, we need at least 3 board members to conduct official business." The room erupted in shouting. People were calling for the dissolution of the HOA, others demanding immediate elections, and a few were actually defending Brenda, claiming there must have been a misunderstanding. Thomas banged a gavel on the table. "Please, everyone, let's keep this orderly. We need to follow proper procedures." A man in the front row stood up. I recognized him as Gerald Porter, a retired attorney who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. Thomas, I've reviewed the bylaws. In the case of board member misconduct, the community has the right to call for a vote of no confidence. I motion that we hold such a vote tonight for the removal of Brenda Patterson as president and her permanent expulsion from the board. Second, someone shouted from the other side of the room. The motion passed with an overwhelming majority. Only 3 people voted against it, and I suspected they were Brenda's personal friends. Next came the vote on Carol Thompson and Richard Hayes. That was more contentious because some people felt they'd been misled by Brenda, but ultimately they were both voted out as well. Then came the real question, what to do with the HOA itself. Gerald Porter stood up again. I've lived under this HOA for 2 decades. For most of that time it was fine. It maintained common areas, organized neighborhood events, and generally stayed out of people's business. The problem started when we elected people who saw it as a power structure, rather than a service organization. I motion that we don't dissolve the HOA, but that we completely rewrite the bylaws to limit its authority to only essential functions. Maintaining common areas, organizing voluntary events, and ensuring safety issues are addressed. No more fines for petty violations. No more color-coordinated mailbox requirements. No more power trips. The room buzzed with discussion. Linda Foster, the treasurer, stood up. I support that motion. In fact, I'll take it a step further. I propose we also implement term limits. No one can serve as president for more than 2 consecutive years. And I propose we require any fine or violation notice to be approved by a majority of the board before it's issued. No more single board members acting as judge and jury. The discussion went on for 2 hours. By the end, we had voted in a complete restructuring of the HOA. The new bylaws would be drafted by a committee of 5 volunteers, including Gerald Porter and 2 other attorneys who lived in the neighborhood. We held emergency elections for the 3 empty board positions, and I was shocked when someone nominated me. I tried to decline, but the nomination was seconded, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of 200 neighbors explaining why I'd be a good board member. I kept it simple. I promise to never steal your propane tanks, and I'll work to make sure the HOA serves the community instead of ruling over it. I won by a landslide. My first official act as a board member was to vote to drop all pending violation notices that had been issued by Brenda Patterson. There were 47 of them, ranging from grass height to unapproved door colors. All gone. The criminal case against Brenda moved faster than I expected. Her attorney reached out to my attorney in early February to discuss a plea deal. Brenda would plead guilty to 1 count of felony theft in exchange for the other charges being dropped. She'd pay full restitution to me for all costs, including legal fees, plus punitive damages. The amount came to $8,000. She'd also serve 1 year of supervised probation and 200 hours of community service. The accomplices took similar deals but with reduced charges and no jail time. Kevin Mills had to pay a $2,000 fine. Carol Thompson and Richard Hayes were both charged with misdemeanors and given probation. I agreed to the plea deal because I didn't want to drag this out. A trial would have taken months and cost me more in legal fees. Plus, honestly, I just wanted it to be over. The sentencing hearing was in late February. I attended and gave a victim impact statement. I kept it factual and focused on how the theft had endangered me during a state of emergency. Brenda stood before the judge, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she looked genuinely remorseful. Her attorney had clearly coached her well. She apologized to me, to the court, and to the community. She talked about how the stress of being HOA president had gotten to her, how she'd let the power go to her head, and how she'd made a terrible mistake. The judge was not sympathetic. "Mrs. Patterson, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust in one of the worst ways possible. You stole essential equipment from a neighbor during a weather emergency. If Mr. Reynolds hadn't had the foresight to install GPS tracking, he might never have recovered his property. If he hadn't had that propane, he could have been seriously harmed. This court takes that very seriously." He sentenced her to the terms of the plea deal, but he also added a special condition. Brenda was required to attend anger management counseling for a full year. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state of Oklahoma. Doug's divorce from Brenda was finalized in April. He got the house, which he immediately sold. He moved to Edmond and started over. We still text occasionally. He's doing better, running his business and trying to rebuild his reputation. He told me he's dating someone new, a teacher who has no interest in HOAs or neighborhood politics. Brenda moved back in with her parents in Midwest City. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she's working as a receptionist at a dental office. She's keeping her head down and staying out of trouble, presumably because she's still on probation. The new HOA board has been functioning smoothly since the election. We meet once a month, handle basic maintenance issues, and organize quarterly neighborhood events. Our first event was a block party in May, and over 100 people showed up. It was the most positive community gathering we'd had in years. People were actually happy to be there, not worried about getting violation notices. I've learned a lot from this whole experience. First, trust your instincts. When I bought that GPS locking cap, people thought I was being paranoid. Turns out I wasn't paranoid enough. Second, document everything. The photos, videos, and GPS data saved me in this case. Without them, it would have been my word against Brenda's, and as HOA president, she might have won that battle. Third, communities thrive when leaders serve rather than rule. The HOA works better now because we've stripped away the power-tripping aspects and focused on actual community needs. My propane tank is still sitting on its concrete pad, still protected by its GPS locking cap. I refinished the bolts and added some additional security features, including a trail camera pointed at it. I'm not taking any chances. The insurance company actually asked me about the whole incident and ended up writing an article about it in their quarterly newsletter as a cautionary tale. The GPS cap company contacted me too, wanting to use my story in their marketing. I agreed, figuring if it helps one other person avoid what I went through, it's worth it. The storm damage in Norman took weeks to fully repair. Power companies worked around the clock to restore service. We didn't get our electricity back for 5 days, which meant my propane setup really did save me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brenda had tried to steal the very thing that kept me safe during the emergency, and her crime had only highlighted how essential it was. I ran into Jennifer Wu at the grocery store in June. She was one of the neighbors who'd been vocal during the whole incident. She gave me a hug in the produce section. "You know you're a legend in the neighborhood now, right?" she said, laughing. "I don't know about that. I just wanted my propane tank back." "No, seriously. You stood up to Brenda when most of us were too scared. She'd been terrorizing people for months with those violation notices. You taking her down freed the whole community." I hadn't thought of it that way. I was just defending my property. But she had a point. The neighborhood was different now. People were friendlier, more relaxed. Front yards had a bit more personality because people weren't afraid to plant flowers that might be the wrong color or put up decorations that might violate some arbitrary rule. The new bylaws were officially adopted in July after a community-wide vote. They passed with 87% approval. The key changes included limiting fines to serious safety issues only, requiring board approval for all enforcement actions, implementing 2-year term limits for all positions, requiring annual financial audits, and establishing a grievance process for residents who disagreed with board decisions. We also added a clause that board members who were convicted of crimes related to their HOA duties would be automatically removed and banned from future service. That last one was called the Brenda Clause, unofficially, though it never made it into the official text that way. My term as a board member has been surprisingly pleasant. We've had to deal with a few legitimate issues like fixing the entrance sign that got damaged in the storm, organizing street repairs, and mediating a dispute between two neighbors over a tree that was dropping leaves in one person's pool. But nothing crazy, nothing that required stealing anyone's propane. The media coverage of the case was interesting. Local news picked it up first, then it went regional, and eventually it made its way onto some national websites. The headline, HOA president arrested for stealing propane tank, caught by GPS tracker, got a lot of clicks. I did one interview with a local TV station, but declined most other requests. I didn't want to be the HOA victim guy for the rest of my life, but the story resonated with people. I got emails from all over the country from people who'd had their own HOA nightmares. Someone in California told me about an HOA that fined them for having the wrong shade of green grass. A guy in Florida said his HOA tried to force him to remove solar panels because they were unsightly. A woman in Texas said her HOA president had filed false police reports against her because she complained about embezzlement of HOA funds. The stories were disturbing and eye-opening. HOAs were supposed to protect property values and maintain communities, but too often they became vehicles for petty tyrants who craved power. Brenda Patterson was just one example in a much larger pattern. There's been some movement at the state level to reform HOA laws in Oklahoma. A state representative from Norman, inspired partly by my case, introduced a bill that would limit HOA enforcement powers and provide more protections for homeowners. It's still working its way through the legislature, but it has bipartisan support. I testified at a committee hearing in September, telling my story and advocating for reasonable restrictions on HOA authority. The most surreal moment came in October when I got a letter from Brenda Patterson. It was handwritten and came through my attorney to avoid violating the no-contact order. In it, she apologized again, but this time it felt more genuine. She talked about how she'd been in therapy and realized she'd been using the HOA role to feel important because other parts of her life felt out of control. She acknowledged that what she'd done was criminal and dangerous. She didn't ask for forgiveness, just said she wanted me to know she understood the gravity of her actions. I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that people are complicated. Brenda wasn't a cartoon villain. She was a person who made terrible choices and had to face the consequences. I hope she's actually learned from this and found healthier ways to deal with whatever was driving her need for control. Doug reached out around Thanksgiving. He was engaged to the teacher he'd been dating. They were planning a small wedding in the spring. He thanked me again for not dragging him into the criminal case any more than necessary. His business had recovered, and he'd actually picked up several new contracts. Apparently, the fact that he'd cooperated with police and testified against Brenda had earned him respect in the community. As for me, life has returned to normal, or as normal as it gets after your HOA president steals your propane tank. I'm still working from home, still serving on the HOA board, still living in my house in Meadowbrook Estates. The neighborhood is better now. We have community cookouts, a book club, and a kids' play group that meets at the park every Saturday. These are things that didn't exist under Brenda's reign, because people were too intimidated to organize anything that might run afoul of some obscure rule. I've also become something of an accidental expert on HOA law and property security. I get calls from friends and acquaintances asking for advice about their own HOA issues. I'm not a lawyer, but I can point them to resources and share what I learned from my experience. I always tell them the same thing. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to push back when the HOA oversteps. The propane tank that started this whole mess is still functioning perfectly. I had it serviced in November, and the technician joked that it was probably the most famous propane tank in Oklahoma. He wasn't wrong. The GPS cap is still attached, still monitoring, still ready to alert me if anyone tries anything stupid. Sometimes I think about that night during the ice storm, watching the GPS dot move from my property to Brenda's house. How angry and helpless I felt. How I couldn't believe someone would actually do something so brazen and reckless. But then I think about how it all played out, how the truth came to light, how justice was served, and how the community ultimately came together to fix a broken system. It's easy to be cynical about neighborhood politics and HOAs. God knows I had plenty of reasons to be bitter. But what I learned is that communities are made up of people, and people have the power to change things when they stand up for what's right. Brenda Patterson tried to rule through fear and intimidation, but that only works as long as people are willing to be ruled. Once we collectively said, "No more," the whole power structure crumbled. The new HOA board held our December meeting last week. We voted to use some of the reserve funds to upgrade the playground equipment at the community park. We also approved plans for a neighborhood garden where residents can rent plots to grow vegetables. These are the kinds of things an HOA should be doing, improving the community and providing value to residents. After the meeting, Gerald Porter pulled me aside. "You know, Zachary, when you first moved here, I thought you were going to be a troublemaker. You questioned everything, you pushed back on Brenda's nonsense, you wouldn't just go along to get along. But you were exactly what this neighborhood needed." Sometimes it takes someone willing to fight to make positive change happen. I appreciated his words more than he knew. It's validating to hear that standing up for yourself can inspire others to do the same. As I sit here now, almost a year after the incident, I can honestly say I'm glad I installed that GPS locking cap. It cost me $200 and saved me thousands in property loss, not to mention potential freezing during an ice storm. More than that, it exposed a pattern of abuse and led to meaningful reform in our community. Would I do anything differently if I could go back? Maybe I would have confronted Brenda about her behavior earlier, before it escalated to theft. Maybe I would have pushed for HOA reform sooner. But probably not. Sometimes things have to get really bad before they can get better. Sometimes you need a crisis to motivate change. The legal restitution from Brenda came through in 3 installments over the year, the last payment arriving in November. $8,000 total, covering my legal fees, the cost of reinstalling the tank, punitive damages, and compensation for the stress and time involved. I used some of it to upgrade my home security system and donated the rest to a local charity that helps low-income families with heating costs during winter emergencies. It seemed fitting. I still see Brenda's name occasionally when I search for information about HOA reforms. Our case has been cited in several legal articles and blog posts about HOA overreach. There's even a Wikipedia page about notable HOA disputes that mentions the Oklahoma propane tank theft case. I'm not sure how I feel about being part of internet history, but if it helps other people understand their rights and fight back against abusive HOAs, then I suppose it's worth it. The neighborhood is preparing for winter again. We've all been checking our heating systems, stocking up on supplies, and hoping we don't get another ice storm like last year. My propane tank is full, the GPS cap is functioning, and I've got backup batteries for my security cameras. I'm as prepared as I can be. But more importantly, I'm part of a community now. Not a community ruled by fear and petty regulations, but one built on mutual respect and cooperation. That's what HOAs should be about. That's what neighborhoods should be about. It took a brazen theft and a criminal case to get us there, but we made it. Sometimes I drive past Brenda's old house, which is now owned by a young couple with 2 kids. They painted the shutters a cheerful blue color that Brenda would have hated, and they put up a treehouse in the backyard that probably violates 6 old HOA regulations. But no one's going to find them because we changed the rules. The neighborhood is better for it. I learned that standing up for yourself matters. Documentation matters. GPS trackers on propane tanks apparently matter a lot. But most of all, I learned that communities can heal and change when good people decide they've had enough of bad leadership. Brenda Patterson tried to steal my propane tank, but what she actually did was steal herself out of power and give the neighborhood back to the people who live here. My propane tank sits outside, white and peaceful, with its GPS tracker quietly monitoring. It's just a tank full of gas, but it represents something more now. It's a reminder that you can fight back against abuse of power, that truth and evidence matter, and that even the smallest acts of preparation and foresight can make all the difference when things go wrong. And if anyone ever tries to steal my propane tank again, well, I'll know exactly where to find it.